Hello, everybody. Tonight is a celebration of a long road to this point where the idea of gifted and advanced learners has become a mainstream topic, and the whole point is to get the word out to more people that there is a population of individuals, which we will wrestle over what to call them tonight. But the issue is that these people have tremendous potential to better themselves, better our families, better our communities, better our world, and are very much at risk for not doing any of those and having a host of difficulties if their needs aren't met. So both high potential and, from where I sit, both high risk as well. And what has happened is a movement within the community and within the schools to help meet the needs of these kids so they can grow optimally. We're going to wrestle with defining what giftedness is, and we're going to agree to disagree, because really it's not really about what to call this group and whether someone is or isn't. We're going to talk about there is a spectrum, there is a realm, and the point is to wrap our minds around all of it. What you see here is in 1972, the Maryland report came out with the first sort of overall definition of giftedness. It looked at general intellectual ability, people who are thought to be really smart, creative or productive thinkers, people who have novel ideas that actually go to product and make new things, people who are high on leadership, people who are advanced in the visual or performing arts, and also psychomotor ability. That actually was deleted, right? So these are people who will be athletes, dancers, and such. Then, recently, a new definition came out, which most people have not even heard. It's recently released from the National Association of Gifted Children, NAGC. The new definition, in its hope to have greater impact on policy, is now talking about you're at the top 10%. So that's a much larger spectrum. And again, where the disagreement will come in is on with people who really care about who is gifted and who is not. And what we're here to talk about, it's not an if, and, yes, or no. It's about a continuum of abilities and hopefully interventions, accommodations, life resources that we can give these people falling on this sort of spectrum. So the new definition is the top 10%, and it looks in the areas of math, music, language, and then also talks about the performing arts, painting, and now goes back to sports. So sports was brought back in. And if you think about professional athletes, which we talk about, which is the best gifted training program in the country, is if you're an athlete, those individuals have exceptional skill. And so a lot of people believed that just because it's not about writing essays or doing complex mathematics, that is an ability that has a ton of potential, and if groomed, can amount to great things. And not everyone is endowed with that same athletic ability. So first we talked about the categories. Now we're talking about top 10%. And we're bringing back that you could have psychomotor, you can be highly intellectual, you can be advanced in your academic abilities, you can be an amazing dancer, you can be an advanced painter, and you also can be an amazing athlete. This is the definition I want to focus on, though, tonight, and I'm going to read this for all of you. Giftedness is asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awareness that are qualitatively different from the norm. This asynchrony increases with higher intellectual capacity. The uniqueness of the gifted renders them vulnerable and requires modifications in parenting, teaching, and counseling in order for them to develop optimally. Wow. This is what we're talking about. This is by the Columbus Group, which was an underground group of gifted professionals who put out this statement in the early 90s, and they kept themselves anonymous to not have criticism from different factions, because there's always been disagreement about what constitutes giftedness. Is it a high test score, or is it, on the other hand, a way of being? Okay? This is the stuff that we really need to focus on. This is the reason that my office is way too crowded with people. As I often tell people, if giftedness was something just to be celebrated all the time, why would there be problems associated with it? It's a very complex topic in our world today and in our educational backdrop today. No Child Left Behind, budget cuts. It's a very challenging time to teach, and it's a very challenging time to be a student, and it's a very challenging time to parent these children as well. You see the highlighted asynchronous development, heightened intensity, develop optimally. Those are the key terms that we're going to talk about. Okay? Asynchronous development is up and down. Imagine peaks and a mountain range. A gifted child, and we're going to use the word gifted for tonight. A gifted child has peaks and valleys all in one being. On once, you might have an 8-year-old who has the reasoning ability of a 15-year-old. They might have the mathematics skills of a 12-year-old. They might have the social skills of an 8-year-old. And they might have the emotional regulation of a 4-year-old. All at once. That's asynchronous development. Heightened intensity we're going to talk about later with overexcitabilities. And the whole key is how to develop optimally. How to maximize one's potential. How to grease the tracks for that person to become all that he or she can be. So 4 major factors that we're going to talk about tonight actually influence what giftedness looks like in an individual, as well as their educational, their social, and emotional functioning. There's level of giftedness. We're going to talk about what it means to be moderately high, really high, what that looks like and what the implications are. Asynchronous development, as we just discussed. Overexcitabilities. We're going to talk about Kazimierz Dombrowski's overexcitabilities. And then finally, thinking and learning styles. And we're also going to move on to what are some at-risk populations, what we need to look at in those populations, and how we can help kids develop to their best. So the higher the child's overall ability, the more that these 4 factors will influence their functioning. Okay, so the more out there you are, the more these different characteristics have to be taken into account, have to be accommodated, have to be understood. So what is normal? So this is the bell curve. Most people fall right in the middle. 1 standard deviation on each side of the mean. As you already could see, if you have a child or teach a child with these gifted abilities, you're in the exception. It's not the norm. But being gifted is invisible. So you often look just like everyone else, but you might start to act a little differently, as we'll talk about. A lot of the programs in our country hit the top 2%. Programs around here are more lenient, and programs around the country are now maybe moving to this top 10%. But again, we're looking at the farther up you are, the more different you are. Now, something that is really powerful is to think at these people are developmentally disabled or mentally retarded. These people are as far from, quote, normal as these people. You're just as far as normal. And appropriately so, you hopefully get a lot of accommodations to have a successful learning environment and a successful life. Lots of accommodations, physical, mental, situational. The argument is these people start to have problems if you don't do a similar thing for them. That's where the accommodations need. And the farther out you are, the farther you're from these people, the farther you feel like you fit in. This is a table that is often used in testing by a lot of psychologists who, educational clinical psychologists who do testing for gifted and gifted schools. Now, again, if you remember, 130 is the 98th percentile. Advanced learners, not to be confused with our advanced learning program. Advanced learners is thought in the world of gifted to be someone who is very bright and very good at school, but won't need necessarily the same accommodations as someone who's gifted. This is a very conservative view. I just want to point out this view so we can look at levels. 130 to 145 is considered moderately gifted. Now, these numbers, which go up to 180, this is really back when people were using the Stanford-Binet test, which is a test that went much higher. Right now, the intelligence test that's used most commonly is the WISC, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, 4th edition. The highest score you can get is 160. That means it truncates the scale. The Davidson Academy looks at profoundly gifted at 145 based on that measure. So I just want to contrast a few different ways of looking at this. Highly gifted, based on this, is looking at 145 to 159. I mean, you're now back to this screen. You're way out here. You're way out here when you get to 145. And then 160 to 179, exceptionally gifted, and then profoundly gifted, very, very rare. But sometimes I just want to tell you when you hear numbers, a lot of people are calling profoundly gifted at 145. On achievement tests, you can get those higher scores. You can get the higher scores like the 160s and the 170s. But again, a lot of people throw around highly gifted, exceptionally gifted, profoundly gifted. When you're talking about that, you're farther and farther away from what's normal and from a way that the world is set up. The world is not set up for you if you live out there. It's just as set up for you as the world is set up for this person without accommodation. Common characteristics of gifted youth, just to go through these. Okay? Gifted youth all come in all shapes and sizes. They don't all have the same things, but generally, a gifted youth has several of these characteristics. This list is taken from A Parent's Guide to Gifted Children by Jim Webb and Associates, which is a wonderful resource. Rapid learners learn quickly, can't learn fast enough. They have a really strong memory. They don't forget anything that you did wrong your entire life, and they're going to remind you of it all the time. They have really large vocabularies, especially at young ages. Actually, there's a list on a really good website that actually says, I said actually, gifted kids say actually at a young age. Actually. Advanced comprehension of nuances. They pick up on things. They have more of this adult-like quality where they're able to read sort of what's going on in the room. Now, we know that some gifted kids have none of that, right? So again, we're just looking at the host. Largely self-taught. How did you learn that? Where did you learn to read? We never talked about that. Where did you pick that up? Some have an unusual emotional depth. Very deep emotionally, very sensitive, which we'll talk more about, really in touch with the environment, with people, with animals, highly sensitive. They can be abstract, complex, logical, and very insightful. This is something that we see a lot, a really rigid and strong sense of justice and fairness. In fact, it breaks up a lot of relationships, and you end up having a big target on your forehead when you're pointing out all the time what everyone did that's wrong and how they didn't follow the rules, and you're telling the teacher, and you're telling everyone. So it has implications. Some adults do it too. Intense feelings and reactions, meltdowns, long attention span and persistence. At a young age, you're doing things like you can't believe how long someone is sitting and playing alone or reading alone or building alone or imaginary play alone. A tremendous attention span. Often can be preoccupied with their own thoughts, their own world, everything that's going on that's way more interesting in there than what's going on out here. How about this one? Impatient with others. You're not doing it fast enough, you're not doing it quick enough, and you're not doing it correct enough. Ask questions, more questions. Want to know why. We'll talk more about that. They have a wide range of interests. Some kids actually have a specific range of interests that they go really in depth on. They're working on their PhDs at age 6 on dinosaurs. And other ones, they love everything, and they just go from one interest to another. They just bounce around. Highly developed curiosity. How do things work? Why is this like that? I want to know. Tough for parenting, right? Why do I have to go to bed? Why do I have to eat when I'm not hungry? How come you have more power over me? We'll talk about that. I'm human, you're human, so I'm not really understanding how this is working. Interest in experimenting and doing things differently. This is more the divergence, the creative people that we're going to talk about. There we go on to divergence. And then actually a lot of them have unusually developed sense of humors at an early age, which is quite remarkable. So those are some characteristics to put us in the ballpark of who we're talking about and what some of the common characteristics of these kids are. Now, Kazimierz-Dombrowski, overexcitabilities have become a really important part of looking at the functioning and experiencing of a gifted child and gifted person. Kazimierz-Dombrowski was a Polish psychiatrist and psychologist who developed a theory of personality development called the theory of positive disintegration, which at another time is a wonderful thing to learn about. The book Living with Intensity, which is both about that and about overexcitabilities, I highly recommend. He lived through World War I, World War II, lost close loved ones, and then was a prisoner in communist Russia. He saw a lot of sadness and suffering in his life through his own experiences and working with lots of others, particularly studying advanced performers, artists, people with advanced abilities. He believed that individuals progressed through the life course and their job was to develop a personality over time, and that there were a few factors that one needed to propel them through the life course. One of the factors we're going to talk about are these overexcitabilities, which is a intense awareness and receptivity and reactivity to one's own internal functioning and also the world outside of them, the external world. In Polish, the word was superstimulability, superstimulated. It got translated to overexcitability. The point being is that you have these tentacles, internally, externally, that you feel very deeply, you think very deeply, you move very deeply, and that these abilities permeate the gifted child's experience, maybe not all 5, we'll talk about some of them, but also shape how they both experience the world and how they become to hopefully do extraordinary things, even if they're suffering along the way, which is another part of his theory about how anxiety and depression are often necessary and useful parts of the growth process to help you get to your next level. And that anxiety and depression is only considered a problem or pathological if you continue to experience them without growing. So he was one of the first people early on to talk about the idea that those are natural, normal human emotions that helped promote growth. And it's why we see, for example, a lot of prolific writers have experienced a lot of those issues along their way, artists of creating wonderful things that have changed our world and society. So there are 5 overexcitabilities: psychomotor, sensual, intellectual, imaginational, and emotional. Psychomotor overexcitability is you are buzzed with energy, the child who cannot sit still, the child who is moving at all times. Their leg is bouncing, their fingers are bouncing, everything's tapping. Some of these kids have twitches. They're twitching. They just have this buzz of energy. They won't go down at night. They can't turn off. That is one of the overexcitabilities, often misdiagnosed, we'll talk about later. Sensual overexcitability, an appreciation for the aesthetics. The nature is beautiful. Sound is beautiful. I love how this tastes. I love how that looks. I love how this how this feels. On the flip side, lots of sensory issues. That tag feels funny. That food doesn't feel right. Screaming when it's too loud. Lights are too bright. So a lot of sensual sensitivities, okay? I like to tell the story about my son when he was 6 and his sensual overexcitability. As I talk about it as one of my proud dad moments. So my wife was taking him out from soccer practice. It was over. And he looked around and he said, "This is my favorite part of soccer practice." And she said, "Really, honey? What is it?" And he said, "Look how the sun is going down over the hills." Which is wonderful, right? It's also not something that necessarily all the other boys were looking at, right? So, but again, so that's an example of the sensual overexcitability, as well as that he will only eat certain things and wear certain things, and if things are too loud, it overwhelms him. So there's both sides of it. Intellectual overexcitability, why? How did? It just incessant questioning and thirst for knowledge. I think this drives lots of these kids. Imagine these kids in a classroom, question after question after question, and there's no time for the answers. You can't go deeper. We've got to get through this lesson plan. And of course, I say this with total empathy for the teaching profession and what is asked of you. We're here just really to talk about the experience of some of these kids when they can't ask the question and have time to go deeper. It's also the ones at bedtime. They don't stop talking. It never stops. In fact, the later it gets, the more awake they are. And maybe the more irritated and impatient you might get. So some strategies often are to have a little journal next to the bed. All right, 3 more questions. Okay, let's write down the 3 for tomorrow night. Try to put a container on it. Imaginational overexcitability. Now, these are the really creative, in your own world, abstract thinkers. These kids are really at risk for school difficulty for a variety of reasons. They often have executive functioning weaknesses, trouble paying attention, remembering to turn things in. They often have elaborate imagination lives. They have imaginary friends. They have worlds that are really exciting and deep, but not conducive to doing your math worksheet. And then emotional overexcitability. This one is where we see lots of meltdowns at ages that we would expect kids to not be doing meltdowns anymore. Overwhelmed by emotion. Overwhelmed by emotion. Also, they could be really in touch with your emotion and other people's emotion too. So sometimes it comes with a sophistication, a sort of social and emotional intelligence that comes with it, where they really get what's going on and it really impacts them deeply. Other time they just get overwhelmed by emotion, they don't have that sophistication, and they're reacting all over the place. Okay? My personal story of emotional overexcitability is being taken to the movie Elephant Man at age 10 for a nice family movie. And basically, I remember having my eyes, being like this with my eyes closed, because I couldn't take the pain of what I imagined the Elephant Man experiencing when he was being bullied. I have clients who can't watch Disney movies because of the same thing. Disney movies, it hurts too much. And basically, with those emotional overexcitabilities, you're just raw. And we have to help these kids develop some coping, understand themselves a little better of why this occurs, but also realize this is why they might also be sensitive to what's happening in the classroom or on play dates, because they feel the other people's pain. They feel when the teacher's getting upset. They might be the ones to say, the teacher was really mad at me. She yelled at me. She's angry at me. And a teacher didn't. She maybe looked a little off. She was a little irritated because the whole class was going off. You know, it could be something that is actually really expected, but the interpretation is through that lens, and she feels the teacher, or he feels the teacher's frustration or pain. So overexcitabilities need to be understood in looking at the personhood of the gifted child when figuring out how to maximize their potential and growth. Learning style. Okay. This is really important as well. There are auditory sequential learners and there are visual spatial learners. What I want you to imagine is a visual, even if you're auditory sequential, and that is think of the auditory sequential visual is one of organization, order, first, second, third, analysis. Everything links to something else in a nice, neat, organized, methodological way. Also highly language-based. Now imagine the visual spatial. Imagine many of your children's bedrooms where they know exactly where everything is, and it's all over the place, and it's just a ball of smoke, and it's like a mad invention with like a Rube Goldberg experiment with this links to this, which links to this, which links to this, which links to this. Many classrooms are set up for the auditory sequential learner. Now, we're getting, the state of education has advanced tremendously in terms of multi-modalities of learning. Still, in most cases, classrooms are set up more for the auditory sequential person, less for the visual spatial. Visual spatial was coined by Linda Silverman at the Gifted Development Center. Wonderful book called Upside Down Brilliance that she wrote. And the research at the Gifted Development Center on hundreds of kids show that approximately 2/3 of individuals are auditory sequential, whereas 1/3 is visual spatial. So that's still approximately 1 in 3 kids in a classroom might be a visual spatial learner. These are bright kids at risk because, again, they're not connecting the dots in the way and in the timelines that things might be expected of them. So really at risk for underachieving and then some social, emotional behavior issues. So if you look back and forth at this list, which I'm sure you have been doing, the auditory sequential person wants explanations. They want language. The visual spatial wants pictures, designs, images. The auditory sequential person processes information one at a time. The visual spatial is more the intuitive learner. Aha, I get it. Okay, we'll show you work. I can't. Okay, that's an F. What? Show your work. I can't. Show your work. Why? Those are the visual spatial people, the intuitive people. Often the math people are a lot of visual spatial. The auditory sequential produces ideas logically. They want to analyze. And again, the visual spatial is more intuitive and wants to synthesize things. So it's not as much of analyzing and pulling apart and putting them in order. It's more putting the whole thing together. The auditory sequential feels really good with concrete tasks, checking off lists. Feels really good. The visual spatial, they like it abstract. They like things open. Let's not worry about deadlines. I'll get to it when I'm done. I'm still thinking about it. I'm not done yet. It doesn't have to be neat. For those of you who can't see each other, there are people looking at each other with funny looks on their faces. So there are visual spatials in the audience, married to auditory sequentials. That doesn't happen by accident. Okay, the auditory sequential person prefers proper working materials. Everything needs to be more proper and organized. And the visual spatial, again, is just going to improvise. What could this be? What could this be? What could this be? The auditory sequential likes facts and details. Great memorizers, right? The visual spatial, nightmare. Not details. Right? Let's remember all the presidents. Let's remember all the states. No. They want the big picture. They don't want the details. The visual spatial learns by understanding the whole concept, the whole thing. The auditory sequential likes all the parts to make the whole. And these are generalities. Now, the auditory sequential person is generally more serious learner, whereas the visual spatial can be more playful. Again, this is often tough in everyday classrooms. So again, the point of this is that the visual spatial gifted child has more difficulty generally in classroom settings. These are kids that we have to keep our eye on because they're still very bright and they want to create and they want to invent and they want to put things together. What we often see actually is they get an assignment which they see as boring, so they put a twist on it to make it novel and new, and then they sometimes get accused of not doing the assignment. And they're floored because they just did it in a creative way. Twice exceptional learner, the twice exceptional gifted person, is someone who is on both ends of the bell curve I showed you before. They're on the high end with their thinking or their academic abilities. They're on the low end because they have a legitimate learning, processing, emotional, or behavior issue. So not only do you have the asynchronous development I talked about, now superimpose an even more extreme valley because you have something else on top of your strengths. And you're walking around with your highest highs and your lowest lows, and you bring that into a classroom. These are examples. These are ballparks. People who are thought to have Asperger's disorder are 2E. They're very, very bright, and they have fundamental difficulties in understanding emotional and social reciprocity, taking the frame of reference of another, understanding and seeing social cues. A lot of gifted kids get accused of this, which we'll talk about. Some of them actually do have it. Some of them don't. It's just an intense gifted characteristic. But imagine you have all of these high abilities, and then you also have something as fundamental as not being able to relate comfortably to peers, even if you don't necessarily have peers at your level that you're around. Creates a huge problem. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So let's say that you are gifted and you have attention, concentration, task follow-through problems. You're very bright, but you don't turn in your work, you forget your work, you can't remember when assignments are due, you're not able to necessarily plan ahead on a long-term project. So all of a sudden you are now getting poor marks, poor grades, and therefore you're now starting to feel pretty dumb. And now you don't believe you're smart, because if you were smart, you'd be like Johnny over here who turns everything in on time. So these kids are really at risk, 2E kids. 2E is a newer concept that is getting a lot more attention. A lot of kids are 2E. A lot of kids are 2E. You have dyslexia. So you have advanced thinking and cognitive abilities, and yet, so you think a couple years beyond and you read and write a couple years below. So how is it determined who's smart in school? Generally, good readers are smart in school. Dyslexic are awful readers until they get wonderful, appropriate intervention. But they're slow readers. They have trouble decoding. They have trouble with spelling. They generally have sloppy writing. And so now you're having someone with an advanced mind who has trouble getting things out in that way. You have my 3 dyslexic kids who, for accelerated reader, they think at advanced levels, but they get tested in the library on how fast they can answer questions, and then are relegated to that portion of the library which is commensurate with their score, so they have to pick out baby books because they can't read fast. Happens quite a bit. Dyslexia, 1 in 5 people in every classroom is dyslexic. Okay? Happens a lot. So how do we keep these kids intact if you're 2E, you're very bright, and you have trouble reading? Feeling good about themselves, feeling that they're not dumb because everyone reads faster than them. Dysgraphia often comes with dyslexia. You have visual motor difficulties. A lot of boys, a lot of gifted boys hate to write. Think how much kids are asked to write in school to show what they know. Copy this off the board, write a sentence. You can't, more and more people are using PowerPoints, that's wonderful. More and more people are doing multi-modality, different ways of showing what you know, doing a speech, teaching kids. But again, there are so many particularly gifted boys who are asked to write everything and they shut down. And then they keep it all inside, both their work and their feelings. Anxiety. Anxiety is actually the reason I ended up in gifted, because a lot of gifted kids, because of possibly the emotional overexcitabilities, the advanced thinking about a lot of things that could happen, the feeling of the universe, that things are a little off right now, the worry about the economy, the worry about the homeless person under the bridge, they're worried. They're worried to a degree that they don't do well at school, they don't do well at tests, they don't perform to their potential, they don't experience life to the best of their ability. All too often, I'm doing an evaluation with a 7 or 8 year old who's not doing well in school, And when I ask my questions about what makes you happy, mad, sad, scared, frustrated, on the worry, they're worried about the person under the bridge that they drive past school every day. They're worried about the cats that are walking around that don't have any homes. These are things that these gifted kids are aware of and keep inside and can distract them. Depression. The farther different you are, the more different you are, you're also at risk for sadness and depression, particularly the older gifted kids, the existential depression, when you start to, and the older gifted kids get there earlier than most people. So you have pre-adolescents, you have 8 and 9-year-olds that are worried about the point of existence. Why do we live in a world with so much pain? What's the purpose? And as you get through adolescence, it can get pretty difficult. All right, these are signs that we have to do something for these kids to help make their life more meaningful. Somehow, inside school, outside of school, volunteering, trying to make a difference. But these are 2E kids. These are things that keep them from maximizing their advanced, gifted potential. So think of all these challenges if you're 2E. Again, a lot of 2E kids are being raised and are being taught today. You have difficulty writing, you have difficulty reading, you're anxious about tests, you can't get the information out, you can't show what you know. You worry about talking. I have some adolescent dyslexic clients that they're so severely dyslexic it affects their speech, and they're asked to get up in front of their high school class and make speeches, where even though they have IQs in the 130s and 140s, they sound like they have tremendous difficulty and then are thought of as dumb. Creates a lot of anxiety as well as school avoidance. Don't turn in your homework. Tough meeting new people. Engaging in socially appropriate behavior. Participating in group activities because of musculature issues, anxiety issues. A lot of gifted kids don't drive a car on time. A lot of gifted anxious kids don't drive a car on time. I often see that they're waiting till they're 18 or older, which, again, is not that big of a deal, but it's interesting that it's a pattern because it does stunt a little of the self-confidence and the independence and autonomy. And then getting a job and going to college. There was an alarming statistic that showed that a huge amount of gifted kids who are identified as gifted in elementary school did not graduate college. A huge amount. So some way these kids start to go sideways if we don't accommodate their needs and help them along the way of realizing their potential. Now there are 2 additional challenges that more and more attention is being given these days. What if you're culturally or linguistically diverse? What if English is not your first language? And you're asked to write on tests, you're asked to read tests, you're asked to perform highly on tests to show what you know, but in English. Just because you don't speak the language doesn't mean you're not gifted. So there's been a lot of work done to look at more tasks and visual spatial tasks and culturally relevant tasks to try to identify more gifted kids in ways than just English language. Low socioeconomic. You have other things to deal with, right? If you're from a low socioeconomic strata, and guess what? You could be just as gifted, but you don't have the access. You don't have necessarily the thinking capacity to focus on what's on that test. If there's a lot of stressors going on with your low socioeconomic status, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, shelter, food, safety, these are kids who are really at risk for not being identified and not being able to be nurtured. And these kids could have everything else we also talked about. They could be twice exceptional, they can be overexcitable, but they're also can be very bright and have a ton to offer. Now, a misdiagnosis, an area I'm very passionate about. Gifted kids are tricky. Sometimes they have things going on, like diagnoses like we're talking about, and sometimes they look like they do, because of just their own personal development, or because the environment is putting pressure on them or not appropriately meeting a need, so they have all of this behavior that looks pathological. So some gifted kids do have ADHD. A lot of gifted kids don't, but when they're in classrooms that aren't academically or intellectually meeting their needs, you look very ADHD. You are highly distractible. You become very impulsive and can be quite silly, and you can become very disruptive. You aren't able to focus on your work, and you stop turning in your work. And you basically say, this is boring, this is stupid. Or you don't even articulate it, you just start making your day more fun and exciting, which is not so fun and exciting for your teacher or other classmates. So that's something that really has to be looked into. You have the psychomotor overexcitability and the intellectual overexcitabilities, which can really fuel that chatter and also that physical activity. And these are tough things to tease apart, but all worth teasing apart when you're looking at what's the roadmap for intervention. Again, Asperger's disorder. Think about all the engineers that you know. Think about the Silicon Valley. Guess what? Some of those people are 2E. Some of them have Asperger's disorder. A lot of them are just engineers. They're just analytical. They're analytical. They are focused on solving problems more than they're focused on the personal relationship. That doesn't mean it doesn't matter to them. It's just how they're oriented and how they come across. So often, particularly highly gifted, profoundly gifted kids, we see a lot who are being misdiagnosed as Asperger's when they're not. They have lots of other things that put them in the gifted category and not in the Asperger's category. Bipolar disorder. This has been a more recent, in the last decade or so, a new common diagnosis for kids. The thing about bipolar disorder, it's very rare. It exists, but it's very rare, and it's very rare in kids and early on, and there's a lot of controversy in the field of what constitutes bipolar disorder, which is basically high ups and low downs, and also really is, with kids, a lot of intense explosiveness and irritability. Lots of gifted kids we see who are really high on the emotional overexcitability are going off all over the place. It is problematic. It does disrupt classrooms. Some of them have to be homeschooled. It can disrupt going out socially. However, much of it is not bipolar disorder. And you really have to look over a long period of time to see how something develops. So it really just to be leery about that diagnosis. But again, we want to focus on behavior, and we want to focus on what a child needs as opposed to getting too stuck on diagnostic categories. But again, just to know that there's a lot of misdiagnosis that occurs. So, risk factors. Again, there are tons of risk factors. Lots of kids end up going sideways because their needs are not met. Intellectual and academic needs of gifted kids need to be met to meet their social and emotional needs. So often we're sort of tricked into thinking that the school experience is about helping kids socialize. Yeah, they already know their math, that's great, good, but really they're behind socially, and that's really what we need to focus on. Try putting a gifted kid with social problems in a social skills group with non-gifted kids. Most of my clients' experiences, their behavior gets worse. Not because it's the other kid's fault, but they don't know how to necessarily relate. And so if you think about who you associate yourself with as an adult and who you hang out with and who you connect with, it's generally someone who shares some ability levels, some thinking, some interest, there's some connection. And often those kids, remember, who are outside the norm are being put in the middle, which makes them look even worse. Because the myth is, if you're so bright, then you should be able to handle this fine. But that's a myth. It's not true. We have plenty of case studies, plenty of your own experiences to know what happens if you take a gifted kid who's higher out on the spectrum and you want him to be regular. He will slowly implode or explode. They slowly start to feel like they're going nuts. They slowly start to give up They slowly start to question the point. They become very anxious. They become very distractible. They become miserable. And they don't know what's going on. All they know is they can't do it. And the irony is they can't do something that's very simple, right? Because if you're so bright, shouldn't you just be able to? So it's this paradoxical thinking. So underachievement is one of the main epidemics that educators, psychologists, counselors all get behind in terms of gifted education and gifted development. Underachievement is huge, and you all know very bright adults who have underachieved their whole life, and it's very, very sad. And at some point, even though I believe in the human potential, there is a point of no return where people are on their life path. It's far down, but they don't come back. Because now with them is a whole set of tapes about who they are in the world, that they never amounted to what they were supposed to. They're never going to be everything. They're not good. They're not as smart as everyone thinks. And they're depressed, and they're anxious, and they're angry. So underachievement is huge. It's one of the main things. And again, I'm not talking about we want kids to achieve. We want kids to be their full person. We don't care. I don't care if a gifted child gets an A and they don't put any effort in. That doesn't matter. We're not talking about A's. We're talking about, can you be what you can be? Are you showing what you have? Are you stretching yourself? Mindset, which many of you are familiar with, Carol Dweck out of Stanford. She talks about two mindsets: fixed mindset, growth-oriented mindset. Most gifted kids end up with a fixed mindset, which is the idea that we're all endowed with a certain amount of intelligence, it doesn't change, and that if the only way that they are bright and gifted is if they continue to do well without any effort, because that's what they're rewarded for. We all say, oh, that's great, you got an A, that's wonderful. Oh, that's a beautiful project. If they didn't put any effort in, we're doing them a disservice. And then you get a fixed mindset, and the research shows that their growth line plateaus out, and they get into avoidance, just doing things they're good at and they can do well, and they don't know how to try and persevere. And they hit a wall at some point, whether it's middle school, high school, college, graduate school, wherever, where they finally have to learn to persevere, and they haven't had that ability. So underachievement is not about grades. It's about meeting your potential. The growth-oriented mindset is learning that your brain is a muscle, that with practice can grow, and that we are always evolving as human beings. We're never done growing. The research shows that those kids didn't care what they got on their grades, on their tests. They actually looked at the questions that they got wrong so they could learn what they had missed, so they could get an A the next time. And I think as a society, parents, all of us, we inadvertently, I think, end up praising and forming the fixed mindset as opposed to a growth-oriented mindset. Social isolation. So who do you hang out with? What if you're way out there? What if there's only a few people in your whole grade that are like you? What if there's 5? What if you're the only one in your whole grade? Who do you hang with? I can't tell you how many gifted boys that I work with who they can't play the game. They can't talk about, the musicians can't talk about cool music, which they know is trash, and they know the people who are talking about the music have no appreciation for music, and they unfortunately tell them that all the time. They can't pretend to talk about caring about the Super Bowl. It's really hard when you can't relate. And you're trying to relate, and everyone's telling you to relate, and everyone's telling you to lighten up, and everyone's telling you to just play the game, and you don't know how. These are also the kids, I want to, again, to go back to Asperger's. When you put two profoundly gifted kids together who don't have Asperger's but are accused of Asperger's, the way that they have social reciprocity for Dungeons and Dragons, for their Raw collection, for Harry Potter is unbelievable. And then you realize, They haven't been around someone like them in 5 years. So all of a sudden, if you look at the environment and who they're with, their behavior changes, which is why, again, we want to downplay this idea if you're going to differentiate, if you're going to grade skip, to not over-focus on social and emotional maturity. You do need to take it into account, no doubt. But you also have to know that you need to have people with their peers. And when you're with your peers, you can be more of who you are. We've talked about anxiety. People who don't get their intellectual and academic needs met, kids, they develop anxiety disorders. Simple. Not all, but they do. They start to feel crazy. So just alone not meeting that need can develop an anxiety disorder. You can start to worry all the time. You do start to feel like you don't fit. You can feel like you're an alien, literally or not. And all of a sudden you're spinning. And the way our brain works is those neurotransmitters kick in and you can't stop them. So this is critical that we meet the needs of these kids. Similarly, depression. You can get depressed when you don't fit in. You don't have anyone to hang out with. You feel lonely. You feel that the world is this mean, awful place because all of a sudden you are a young person without life experience who can see what's going on in the world like we all can, without the reasoning abilities to help us mitigate them. So this is really serious. And while we're here to celebrate the movement of gifted awareness and meeting the needs of gifted children in our district, in other districts, it's because they are so at risk if you don't. We're living in an environment where if you look at the global economy, if you look at our place in the world, we need great minds to solve things sooner than later. And we need them to come from the United States too. There are great minds all over the world, but we're focusing on our minds here. And the wonderful thing about Gifted Ed, it is international. There's a Gifted Ed movement internationally. We're focused on how do we get our young minds to soar. What we really want to think about is how do we get these kids' needs met? How do we get their intellectual and academic needs met? They're in school 7 hours a day. It's a long time. Are we going to get their needs met in an after-school program, one afternoon a week? As we say, we're not just gifted on Wednesdays from 2 to 4. Remember, it permeates their existence 24/7. If you're teaching one of these kids or raising one of these kids, you know exactly what we're talking about. It never stops. They wish it could stop. They wish they could turn off their brain. They can't. They need to be challenged, not to get good grades, but to stretch just beyond where they are. They need to be inspired. They need to be coaxed to take risks and to grow. When are they going to learn to push themselves? Tons of pre-med students drop out. All of a sudden, they're around a bunch of smart people and they have to work hard, and no one taught them how to do that. We can teach them. We can make life hard for them. Like this is good. We want to make life hard. We want to teach you to persevere. You know how many of these kids are crying at the homework table because something is too hard? Or they're crying at the homework table because something's too easy. Or they're saying they hate school because it's boring. They're passionate about something. All these kids are passionate about something. They never stop talking about what they're passionate about, even if it's Harry Potter, even if it's Percy Jackson. if it's the Roman Empire. There are 100 different directions to take what they're passionate about and make it learning. Take it deeper. Pace. There are a lot of gifted kids that learn so fast that I can't imagine being their teacher and how fast had to put information in front of them because they devour it. Or they come in it. The average gifted kid sometimes knows 65% of that year's curriculum the first day of school. So some learn fast, but guess what? Others learn really slow. There's lots of gifted kids, the visual spatial kids. They're slow processors. They can't go fast. Schools actually become very fast. Schools become very timed. Some of the developers of the Wechsler test, the intelligence tests, had said when they were talking about how they added processing speed in terms of intelligence, one of the famous quotes was, "I can't imagine anything that's worth anything important that has to be done fast." So we're telling kids, math facts, quick. Read, quick. 2 minutes, go. 50 problems in a minute, go. These slow processors, they're brain locks. And a lot of the slow processors actually, remember, they're not good with facts. So a lot of them don't know their math facts. And so now they're asked to be doing that fast. That doesn't work for them. So again, when we're talking about differentiation to their learning, an individual learning plan, formal or informal, how do they process? We know they're smart, so how do we stretch them? Do they need stuff fast? Do they need some things slow and in depth? It's all learning. I think that's something we have to keep remembering. It's all learning. They're there to learn. And how to make that fit with the realistic challenges of the standards that we have to meet. That's a reality. Their intensities and sensitivities permeates their existence. This is why they're going off. This is why they're really sensitive. This is why they get overwhelmed. This is why they're questioning authority. This is why they can't stop at the red light when they really should. A great story about Sal Mandoglio. He's one of the people, a psychologist in Canada, who wrote one of the first books about Dombrowski's theories. And he was talking about, he said, let me give you an example of this intensity that gets you into trouble. He said, I'm going to give a personal example. He said, it's this, you can't stop with your notion of truth, even if you should stop with your notion of truth. He said, we were out shopping, I was here visiting with my wife, and we got to a store, and she said, we really need this, and it was a high-ticket item. And she said, we really need this because X, Y, and Z. And he said, I knew I should stop, but I couldn't. See, the thing was, I agreed with the item, but I disagreed with her reasoning. And I couldn't stop myself from arguing with her reasoning. And therefore, we were in a fight because I wasn't supporting the purchase, which I actually believed in. These kids are doing that all the time. Why do I have to do that homework? Why do I have to learn geometry? When am I going to use that? Ever again? Have you ever used it? Really? Do you still remember it? How fast can you do it? That's actually not correct. That's not the capital. And then you get called into the office because you're disrespecting authority. And they're dumbfounded because actually they were just correcting something. They're not picking up that socially it's not that cool to publicly call out the teacher twice a day, every day. Trying to understand where they're coming from. It doesn't excuse behavior. We have to understand behavior. All too often, these kids are misunderstood. We need to always focus on their strengths. Think about what you all are doing in life. I guarantee you, as soon as you could, you ran away from your weakness area as quick as you could. Psychology was cool for me because I only had to take statistics. I was done with math. Everyone has their own story. In school, these kids are judged on everything all the time. The expectation is if you're gifted and bright, you're going to be good at everything all the time. It's an inherent bias. that we have. If you're gifted and bright, you're going to be good at everything all the time. If you're not, then I guess you're not that bright. What are we telling these kids? If you can't focus, well, I don't know. Then maybe you're not all we thought you were. They all have a strength. They're going to get to where they go in life by what they're good at. How at an early age do we support that? The biggest challenge these days? Computers. These kids are playing a lot of video games. These kids are doing a lot of digital media. These kids are doing a lot of programming. Guess what? What % of our jobs are actually going to be related to that by the time they're there? Bill Gates, Bill Joy, 20 hours a day programming. Worked out pretty well for them. Microsoft and Sun Microsystems. It's a judgment call. Often I'm working with parents who want their gifted kids to have balanced lives. That is a challenge, to be gifted and balanced. There's an intensity and a passion and overexcitability, a drive that comes with creative and thinking and going beyond what is just normal. It's not better than being normal, whatever that is. It's just different. And it's a drive that has to be nourished and nurtured. It has to be. So focus on their strengths. When you have a twice exceptional kid, what do you do when they have to spend 3 hours a week learning to read at the ability level of their classmates when they're still a year behind? Well, the rest of the time you put them in the things they love that they feel good about themselves. Nature, art, gymnastics, extra science. How do you both elevate them in their area of strength, differentiate them, and accommodate a weakness? Lots of gifted kids have executive functioning issues, whether we call it ADHD or not. It's just a growing epidemic of high on thinking abilities and lower on putting it all together abilities. How do we support them while their frontal lobe is developing until they're older? How do we not worry about at age 10 they're never going to make it at college when they're 10? So how do we lead with their strengths, make them feel good and stretch and prepare them to be something in the world where they learn how to persevere, they learn how to take risks, they learn how to create, and they learn a little bit about the game that they need to play to get by in this world at the same time, because that's important too. But if we focus too much on how do you play the game and not on this other stuff, they'll go sideways, they'll underachieve, and they won't perform to their potential. Thank you.